Alright, we are back with another video, this time talking about total drama. In today's video, I'll be doing a winner ranking or a finalist ranking for total drama based on the games they played in the respective seasons. Obviously, we got news a while back that we'll be getting two new seasons of the show moving forward, and while we wait for those to come out, I decided to put this together. Now, when making this video, there were two main obstacles I came across. One is that each season of Total Drama has two different endings, and the country you live in will determine who is the official winner of each season. For that issue, I decided to just include everyone that made it to the final two. I guess you could say that whoever won in Canada is the official winner, but at that point, it's just kind of arbitrary. Basically, anyone that has an ending in which they're the winner will be included on this list. I guess you could say this is more of a finalist ranking, but I like the sound of winner ranking better. The other issue I had is information. Unlike shows like Survivor or Big Brother, where we get a lot of information about the strategies and the relationships, Total Drama is a lot more condensed and, at points, inconsistent with showing the actual game being played. Challenges, jokes, and random character moments are just the main more of a focus on Total Drama than on Survivor or Big Brother. And it's really hard to tell sometimes whether certain moves are being made strategically or whether they're being made for personal reasons. I'm sure some people would even go as far as to say that this entire exercise is pointless, but I don't really care. I'm going to give it my best shot, and you guys can decide for yourselves if it was worth it. Now, this list will be solely based on the game that they played on their respective seasons. It will not be based on what I think of them as a character. It will not be based on whether I think their ending is better for the season. And it's certainly not based on how they are as a player in the grand scheme of total drama. It's solely based on the game that they played on their winning season. So, looking at this list, there are 6 seasons of total drama to go over, each with the final two. That gives us 12 winners to assess. I will not be including the Redonkulous Race, as that is a radically different game from the rest of the series, and obviously, spoilers for every season, so if you don't want to be spoiled, this is your chance to click out of this video. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the list. So to start things off, we have our bottom tier winners. Now, the bottom three winners on this list are all people that should have been voted out, but were largely saved due to either non-elimination rounds or other weird things that caused them to not get sent home. So at number 12, we have the worst winner in total drama, in my personal opinion. And I know a lot of people love this person on the season. They think that their winning game was very satisfying for the season, but if we're just looking at the game that they played, I think that they're the worst winner. So at number 12, we have the winner of Total Drama World Tour. We have Heather. Now, Heather Play is known for having this big redemption arc in World Tour, and a lot of people love her because of that. And again, if this were a list based on how I think the winner contributes to the season, she would definitely be higher in this list. But if we're just looking at the game that she played, the reason she's at the bottom is because she was voted out. So again, it's a pretty weird game to look at. She's the first to recognize that Alejandro is a manipulative and dangerous player, but due to her reputation, no one believes her. She ends up on Team Amazon, which is pretty favorable for her, as they end up winning most of the immunity challenges pre-merge, even though she's easily the most hated person on Amazon, and more than likely would have been voted out had they lost some of those early immunity challenges. In fact, in the Amazon episode, that's exactly what happens, where Heather is literally voted out 3 to 1 to 1. She should have been out of the game at that point, but then Chris reveals that it wasn't a real elimination ceremony, pretty much saving her for another day. And for me, that alone is what kicks her to the bottom tier of this list, as she was essentially voted out and was literally about to be kicked off the plane, but was saved, most likely because Chris felt like it would create more drama to keep her around. So again, I mean, I get that non-elimination episodes are part of the season, but they had no idea this was coming until literally the votes have been cast in red. So because of that, I essentially treat Heather as if she were voted out there. And really, she stays at the bottom for a lot of this early game. Like, she really only survives because Team Amazon keeps winning immunity. It's not until Duncan re enters the game and the whole love triangle situation happens that Heather is finally able to get the target off her back. From that point on, all the attention is on Gwen, Duncan, and Courtney, and Heather is able to fly under the radar. And when Team Amazon finally has to vote someone out right before the merge, Heather is a swing vote there, where she could have either voted out Gwen outright or voted for Courtney and forced a tie. I mean, she obviously chooses the latter option, which I think is the correct move, as it would have A, weakened Alejandro, as Courtney was becoming a number for him at that point, and B, kept around Gwen, someone that would have been a bigger target than her moving forward. Now, it doesn't end up working out as Gwen loses the tiebreaker, but I don't necessarily blame Heather for making that decision. For the next few rounds, Heather keeps trying to get rid of Courtney, but to little success. In the Sweden episode, she's able to get the numbers to do so with Cody and Sierra, but that turns out to be a non elimination round. After that, both Courtney and Duncan win immunity, forcing her to vote out Owen, and then after that, Courtney is eliminated, even though Heather voted for Blaney, but whatever. From that point on, Heather tries to get rid of Alejandro, mainly by aligning with Sierra. But Sierra is so delusional during those next two rounds, especially during the Rapa Nui episode, that Heather literally decides it's not worth it and tries voting out Sierra, even though Sierra votes for Alejandro. Now, ultimately, Sierra stays there as it was a non elimination round, but that's not a great look for Heather's game. Yes, while I think Sierra played it worse to where she wouldn't go along with something that was in her best interest at that point, that's still not great on Heather's end that she took her eyes off the prize in that episode. Fortunately, she's able to come to her senses in episode 24 and gets both Cody and Sierra to vote out Alejandro. And had the elimination ceremony played out like normal, she would have got Alejandro out at that point, and she would have gone to the final three in a much better position to where she's more likely to win the final two challenges, like against Cody and Sierra, than she would have against Alejandro. But instead, Sierra has to mess everything up by blowing up the plane and getting ejected in the process. As a result, Heather now has to compete against Alejandro in those final two challenges, someone that is far more physical and likely to beat her. The one bright side of this, though, is that Sierra is able to help out Cody during that final three challenge, which in theory increases the probability that someone other than Alejandro gets to the final two. But in the end, Heather ends up having to face Alejandro in the final challenge, where she's able to win by manipulating him. So, looking at Heather's game more broadly, I think she's someone that plays half of a good game. From the point where Duncan re-enters the game, I think she does relatively well, despite certain things not going her way. But the main problem, though, is that she was going to be voted out at that Amazon episode had it not been a non-elimination episode. Now, again, she's not the only winner on this list to essentially be voted out, as we'll talk about in a minute. But the fact that this happens to her so early in the season, literally the first time her team loses a challenge, is a big reason she's at the very bottom of this list. I just can't ignore that. But even if we do ignore that, she's at the bottom of her team for so much of that early game. She was always going to be voted out at the first opportunity, and it's the fact that that opportunity never arose that kept her in the game. The only reason she's able to get out the bottom is due to Duncan entering the game and the triangle shifting attention away from her, but she had almost nothing to do with that. I mean, yes, I give her credit for playing into that and wanting to keep Gwen around in order to keep that conflict going, but the fact that it was almost entirely out of her control means that I can't give her too much credit. Had the game played out naturally and Duncan not entered the game along with his drama, I don't think Heather wins the season or gets anywhere close to the end for that matter. So it's for those reasons that I decided to put her at the bottom. Again, I think for the season, like in her whole redemption arc, it's a very satisfying story narratively. But if we're going off this list, which is based on gameplay, I have to put her here at the bottom at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and I feel like this pick is going to be even more controversial than putting Heather at the bottom, as I know a lot of people consider this person as being one of the best winners, definitely one of the best manipulators in the history of total drama. But looking at their game, I mean, they had the same problem in that they were about to be voted out. So at number 11, we have the other winner from World Tour. We have Alejandro. Now, obviously, Alejandro is credited for playing a very dominant game in World Tour, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But again, the reason I have him this low on the list was because he was about to be voted out at the Final Four. We know from that episode that he was voted out 3-1 and would have been the boot had Sierra not blown up the plane and gotten herself ejected. But we'll get back to that in a moment. Let's just start at the beginning. So yes, he starts off the game doing some great work, getting on people's good side. The only person that doesn't fall for him is Heather, but again, considering her reputation, no one really respects her. He gets put on Team Chris, which wins a lot of the early challenges. Even so, he is responsible for a lot of the eliminations to happen on Team Victory. He convinces Harold to quit as a way of impressing Lashana. He also causes Bridget to get stuck to a pole, which directly results in her elimination. Now, while a lot of this is an impressive display of control and social manipulation, I don't think all these actions are necessarily optimal. While getting rid of Harold made some sense as he's somewhat intelligent, like how he found out Owen was a mole in action, Bridget was completely loyal to him, and him tossing her out so soon was a missed opportunity. The next few rounds go by eventlessly, however. He does try to branch out, building an alliance with DJ, who ends up being the last Team Victory member, but once again, Alejandro throws us away when he sabotages the challenge, resulting in DJ's elimination. After that, Team Chris loses the next challenge, and Duncan enters the game at that point. He makes quick work of blindsiding Noah, someone that didn't trust him by that point, by getting Duncan's vote. Even so, there's mutual distrust between him and Duncan. But before that can become a serious issue, however, Alejandro is able to convince Tyler to reveal to everyone that Gwen and Duncan kissed. This not only blows up Duncan's position, but it makes Courtney vulnerable to his manipulation. And that he does, as he builds yet another ally in Courtney. He also quickly disposes of Tyler before he could reveal Alejandro's role in the love triangle fiasco, although he was initially going to vote out Duncan in that spot, but I could take that or leave it. Once the merge hits, Alejandro is able to get out Owen, someone that was slowly growing more suspicious of him. He then loses Courtney, which isn't great for his game, but then follows it up by voting out Duncan. But then he ends up in a pretty bad Final Four scenario where he's against Cody and Sierra, the latter of which is planning to take the former, and Heather, the one person in the game that knew his stick from the beginning. Now he tries working on Cody, the one person that could be flipped, to try and gain his loyalty. He also tries to flip Sierra against Heather by convincing her that Heather is hitting on Cody. But really, he needed to win immunity at the Final Four, as he was clearly the biggest target on the board at that point. And when he's unable to, he's voted out, or would have if Sierra didn't get ejected. But after that, he makes it to the final three, beats Cody in the tiebreaker to face off against Heather, and while he's manipulated by her and probably should have lost, he wins on a technicality when Heather accidentally throws his dummy into the volcano instead of her own. So overall, Alejandro did play a pretty impressive game. If he wasn't voted out the Final Four, I would consider him a top tier winner and he'd be a lot higher on this list. But he was voted out, and that's the main reason he's lower on this list, as, well, he shouldn't even be on the list. Even outside of that, I don't think he was perfect. I mean, there were definitely points earlier in the game where I felt like he was just throwing away allies just for the sake of being evil. Like the fact that he plays a direct role in Bridget getting voted out, or that he puts the work into building an alliance with DJ only to sabotage his last chance of survival, are pretty unnecessary moves in my eyes. And again, I feel like he's just being manipulative and sneaky just to be a villain. That's not particularly great. At the same time, I felt like he kept certain people in the game way longer than what was good for him, like people like Heather, Duncan, and Sierra. Granted, that was partially due to factors outside of his control, like being on different teams pre merge, but those are still things that harmed his game, as it put him in a pretty bad position in the Final Four. Even if you don't think him getting voted out at the Final Four is that big of a deal, the fact that he allowed himself to get into that scenario to begin with, to where he probably would have been voted out, like had he not won immunity and had Sierra not blown up the plane, that's not particularly great for him, and that's something I do hold against him any way you slice it. So, again, him getting voted out is the reason I have him here at number 11. However, even outside of that, his game was definitely not perfect, so I have him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have someone here that technically wasn't voted out, but was largely saved due to a fluke that was completely out of their control. But at number 10, we have the winner of Total Drama Action. We have Duncan. Now, while you'd think Duncan would have entered the season with a massive target on his back, he's surrounded by a bunch of endgamers from Island. Early on, the show focuses on his relationship with Gwen, which is strong enough to where he's the first selected to be on our team during the schoolyard pick. And really, he gets pretty good draw as his team only attends two elimination ceremonies in the entire pre-merge. Unfortunately for him, his growing friendship with Gwen spawns a downward spiral for Trent, which Justin is able to leverage into manipulating Gwen to tank her own game. And at that first elimination ceremony, Duncan loses Gwen, which isn't great. But afterwards, he becomes the team's de facto leader, helping them through a string of immunity wins, although he isn't helped by the DJ quit. Despite the season positioning, Duncan rejects an alliance with Lashana and Harold simply because he doesn't like Harold. Now, while I understand the logic of not aligning with a duo, the fact that he refuses the alliance simply for personal reasons, while ignoring the threat of Heather winning immunities post merge, as she did on Island, is a misstep. Courtney enters the game, which you'd think would be a good thing for him, only for her to be mad at him, thinking he's cheating on her with Gwen, which is a bit funny in hindsight. But they're on separate teams, so this doesn't have immediate repercussions. When he does go back to the elimination ceremony, he votes out Heather, which is better for his game as he and Heather never had that great of a relationship. Then we get to the merge, which is a bit of a down slope for his game. He and Harold finally paper over their differences enough to form an alliance with Lashana, which is a little strange as Lashana first pitched the idea as a way of voting out Heather, but whatever. Along the way, he repairs his relationship with Courtney and builds a guy's alliance with Justin. But then after Courtney wins immunity, he's targeted by the other woman as a way to weaken Courtney. He convinces Courtney to vote out Lashana, but completely botches his pitch to Harold, who was closer to Lashana at that point. Courtney is the one to convince Harold to save Duncan, telling him that the women were targeting him instead. Now, while you can somewhat credit Duncan for having a strong enough relationship with Courtney to where she works to save him, the fact that he was in the bottom two during this round is pretty bad, coupled with the fact that, again, he just botched his pitch to Harold. But by getting rid of Lashana, Duncan should be in a decent position to run the game, the guys' alliance plus Courtney. But then he and Justin ruin it for themselves the very next round, where for some reason they start getting on each other's nerves, and then Justin tries hitting on Courtney, and none of this bodes well for any of them. And Justin is voted out, but not before Duncan is in the bottom two again. But through that, Duncan is in a very precarious position going to the initial final five, where he has Lindsay and Beth, a tight duo targeting him, Courtney, who I guess you could say is more loyal to him at this point, and Harold, who is very incentivized to turn on him at this point. And Owen re-entering the game as a mole also isn't good for Duncan, as he's more against Courtney at this point than anyone else. And after Courtney wins immunity for the third straight time, Duncan is the main target. Lindsay and Beth flip Harold to their side, and while Owen decides to throw away his vote on Courtney, they had the numbers to send Duncan home. He was going to be voted out there. The reason he isn't voted out, however, is because Lindsay accidentally votes for herself, causing a 3-1, 2-1 vote where she goes home instead. While you could point to Owen being unwilling to vote for Duncan as a boon for me for his game, Duncan had almost nothing to do with Owen throwing away his vote. While the last few rounds weren't particularly great for Duncan, this moment right here is a massive knock against his game, as even without Owen, the numbers were literally there for him to go home. He should have gone home there and was only saved by a fluke. After that, Courtney attempts to form an alliance with Beth, which could have been an obstacle to Duncan in the endgame, but that blows up by the time of the next vote. He votes out Harold, which is fine, I guess. Then at the final four, he votes out Courtney, which I understand to an extent, as Courtney was the biggest physical threat left in the game by that point, and Duncan realistically would have had a better chance against Owen or Beth in the final challenge. But on the other hand, she was pretty mad with him on her way out and did not handle that situation the best. And considering this season is decided by a jury vote, that's definitely something that could have really harmed his chances of winning there. But from there, he gets to the final two with Beth, ties with her in the challenge, and narrowly beats her in the jury vote. Now, the show wasn't entirely clear on who got the vote in the jury, as we only saw 7 votes be read, but that also includes pre-merge boots like Gwen, DJ, and Heather. It's not exactly clear whether it was only the certain people that could vote or whether they decided to just not read all the votes. But based on my own forecast for the entire cast, excluding Jeff and Bridget, I determined that Duncan had more locked votes than Beth. In my estimation, he had the locked votes of Owen, which is confirmed on the show, Courtney, which is all but said on the show, Heather, as I don't think she would ever vote for Beth, and most likely Gwen, as she had a closer relationship to Duncan than to Beth. he would need two more votes to win, and in this scenario, I believe he would do so with the votes of Izzy, assuming the producers sat her down and forced her to vote for one of the finalists, and Justin, someone that did fight with Duncan on his way out, but in the end respected him more than Beth. So overall, I feel like Duncan had a pretty good pre-merge, as again he was sort of the leader there, and he did some stuff post-merge like forming a guys alliance, kind of like what he did in Island. But his post-merge is a very mixed bag. I mean, he benefited from the season being a jury vote for one, but aside from that, he was literally in the bottom two three times in a row. Now, while you can give him some slack there and say that he was only targeted because Courtney won immunity, the fact that he was so closely aligned to Courtney, or perceived to be, to the point where people were targeting him as a way to weaken Courtney, is not a great look for him at all. Again, the fact that Lindsay round was so wonky to where he should have gone home there, but Lindsay accidentally voted herself out. That's a very bad look for him. And like I said, he was benefited from the season being decided by a jury vote. Now, again, he did convince Courtney to save him. I mean, and ultimately he was able to convince her to vote for him in the final jury vote. But again, like assuming this would have been decided by a challenge, I mean, there's no guarantees that he wins the challenge. I mean, and considering that he could have blown up his game, I mean, those are all things that I just can't overlook. So it's a very messy post merge, in my opinion. And again, like the Lindsay round is the sole reason he's this low on the list. But even outside of that, I mean, his game wasn't great. So I had to put him here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and I feel like the most of the rest of this list is pretty hard to put together, as I feel like a lot of the winners we'll be talking about are pretty close together, really. I mean, some of them played better games than others, but a lot of them also have pretty big mistakes in their game. So I feel like it was just a matter of determining who played more impressively and who had bigger flaws than others. So at number 9, we have someone that I think played the least impressive game in this group. We have the original winner of Total Drama. We have Owen. Now, Owen played a pretty strong social game, befriending pretty much everyone in the cast except for Heather. Despite having some pretty gross habits and being inconsistent in challenges, he's both likable and useful enough to where people want to keep him around. Strategically, though, he's very passive through a lot of the game, getting persuaded by others to make certain moves even if he doesn't come up with them himself. He could have gotten Heather out the second elimination ceremony, but she was able to bribe him to vote out Justin with a piece of cake. And really, despite Heather constantly getting on the Screaming Gover's nerves, Owen doesn't do much to try to get rid of her. Voting out Cody was kind of a no brainer, but then he goes along with voting out Beth due to her cursing the tribe. Although some of that was probably due to him costing his team the challenge and wanting to deflect blame elsewhere. But even then, I feel like he should have tried to deflect blame on Heather, who was the leader there, and played a more direct role in costing them the challenge. Really, though, I would attribute a lot of the Gophers' inability to vote out Heather as a collective failure, more so than Owen's individual failure. But even then, Owen didn't do much to shift the tides when he could have had the social capital to do so. At the merge, he and the other guys get closer together. During the Trent round, he is technically in the bottom two at the marshmallow ceremony, but I don't think the order mattered too much, as I think it was pretty clear that Trent was going home and Chris was just rattling them off one after the other. After that, he agrees to join Duncan's All Guys Alliance, which, despite his reluctance and Jeff's defection to save Bridget, they are able to say Owen at the next marshmallow ceremony where he is in the bottom three there. Now, while this guy's alliance is a good short-term move as the women were too divided to leverage their numbers advantage, I don't think it would have been wise for Owen to commit to it all the way. If the final four had been DJ, Duncan, Jeff, and Owen, I don't think he wins the game. He either would have been voted out due to being too likable, or been dragged to the end as an easy opponent in the final challenge. After all, he would have been going up against three pretty athletic guys, and I think those guys probably would have wanted their own to win instead of Owen. Now, fortunately for Owen, the alliance kind of falls apart soon afterwards, with DJ and Jeff going out in rather quick succession. while he does lose Izzy along the way, he eventually gets into a pretty ideal final five with Gwen and Lashana, a duo, Duncan, someone that's closer to him than anyone else at that point, and Heather, someone that is both an easy target if she doesn't win immunity, and someone that is more inclined to vote with him than with Gwen and Lashana. Now, how much did he do to get this final five? Not much, if I'm being honest. I mean, he has almost nothing to do with the guys' alliance falling apart. He has nothing really to do with DJ or Jeff getting voted out, but he gets this final five anyway. He's then greatly benefited by the eliminated players accidentally voting out Lashana when it seems like most of them wanted to vote out Heather instead. But then at the final four, he's put in a pretty bad position when both Gwen and Heather win immunity. And considering he ticked off Jeff earlier that day by eating his sticky buns, there was a chance Chef could have eliminated him due to that. But ultimately, he spared as Chef had a worse overall relationship with Duncan on the season. And at the final three, he and Gwen gang up on Heather in the challenge, ensuring they'd be a final two. Now, coming into the finale, we saw that among the eliminated players, only half of them were on his side. Even worse, only 4 of the 10 players that made the merge were on his side. So if this had been a jury vote where all the merge players get to cast their votes for the winner, Owen would have been in a bad spot going into that. Now, despite this, he is able to convince most of the Gwen supporters to go over by promising a party, which is something I guess. But that doesn't really matter as he ends up winning the final challenge. So overall, Owen didn't necessarily play an actively strategic game. I mean, I guess the biggest move you can give it would be after the cooking challenge, where despite him being a direct cause of his team losing the challenge, he's able to convince them that Beth's cursed idol was more to blame. But even then, I feel like he would have been better off trying to deflect blame onto Heather, who was the self-appointed leader and was more of a drag in the overall challenge than Beth Heather was. But really, a lot of his success in the game stemmed from his likability. I mean, while he was in the bottom three times, technically four, but one of them was the Mr. Coconuts round, so does it really count? The only time where it seemed like he was in danger was at that final four. Aside from that, I don't know how much respect I could really give him strategically, as a lot of the stuff was just handed to him. I mean, the guy's alliance was handed to him. The guy's alliance falling apart was handed to him. The whole Final Five situation was handed to him. Duncan came to him with the alliance and, that whole situation. I mean, there's just so many instances in the game where it seemed like he was just doing what he liked personally rather than what was in his own strategic best interest. Like, he didn't really do much in the game. So while I think he was better positioned than a lot of other people in the game, I think his lack of agency is the big reason that I have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who kind of like Owen was benefited by things outside of their control and was definitely in more danger at more points than Owen, but also someone that I think was a bit more active, someone that did more to seal their own fate. So at number 8, we have the winner of Total Drama Pocatello Island. We have Skye. Now, again, Skye played an mediocre game. I mean, there were definitely points where she was in danger and definitely some missteps there, but I feel like again she at least had more blatant alliances than Owen and someone that was playing the game a bit more strategically than Owen. She starts off the game on the red team where they get off to a pretty rough start, losing the first 2 challenges. However, she's never in much danger. They take out pretty easy targets in Beardo and Leonard, but on her team, she formed some pretty decent relationships, namely with Shawn and Dave, the latter of which develops a crush on her. She does her best to get closer to Dave, even as she notices his feelings for her. However, slowly it becomes more awkward. I mean, some of it is due to her kind of not reciprocating those feelings. I mean, she kind of does, she kind of doesn't. But she also becomes jealous in episode 5 when Ella, of all people, starts flirting with Dave. Meanwhile, Sugar gets on her radar and tries at every opportunity to drive a wedge between her and Dave. Eventually, she and Max switch teams though. There, she bonds with Jasmine, and after the team loses the next challenge, it's an easy vote against Toffer, although Toffer votes for her, which isn't ideal. Then we get to the merge, which is a very wacky round for her. She snaps at Dave, finally telling him that she isn't interested, and supposedly this is what gets her into the bottom 2 at the next elimination ceremony. However, she's saved by Dave voting himself out. I mean, take that as you will. After that is the Max and Scarlet ejections, which pretty much automatically sends Skye to the final four. At that point, she's not in the greatest spot in the world. She recognizes that Jasmine and Shawn are a duo and tries to counteract this by aligning with Sugar. However, it quickly becomes clear that Sugar has no intention of working with her. So, really, she's in a very bad spot in this Final Four round. But despite this, Sky's benefited that the Final Four is where instead of a vote, the results will be determined by a challenge where the person that comes in last is automatically eliminated. This format not only allows Skye, someone that is pretty good physically, to survive the final four, but it also takes out Jasmine, Shawn's closest ally at that point, improving her odds at reaching the end. And she does reach the end when a second place finish in the challenge, setting her up against Shawn, and she wins at the end. Now, again, the game I just described wasn't particularly dominant, as I feel like she was in danger at more points than Shawn was, and a lot of the other winners we'll be talking about were. But the reason I have Skye as high as she is one, I feel like she was more active than Owen or some of the other people we've already talked about. And, she wasn't in the best position, but I feel like she was in a better position than Heather and some others. And again, like she at least wasn't voted out. I mean, yes, while she is benefited by the Final Four format, you know, and I will knock that against her to a certain degree. It's better than being voted out, and she is able to turn that in her favor by coming in second in the challenge. So for that reason, I decided to put Skye here at number 8, but I'll admit that she isn't the best winner. Now we're moving on to number 7. We have a winner who, like Skye, was a bit more active in the game, was a bit more involved in making their own fate, even if they were in some pretty bad positions at certain points. But at number 7, we have the other winner from Total Drama Island. We have Gwen. Now, again, I think Gwen played a pretty good game, but not without its flaws. She didn't enter the season with the best social game, as she didn't seem super willing to bond with a lot of the players. Even so, she manages to draw people to her from early on. While Heather doesn't particularly like her, she starts bonding with Trent. She also builds a good relationship with Lashana, and while she doesn't reciprocate, Cody at least likes her a good amount. And really, that's enough to carry her through a lot of this pre-merge, although her hand in winning the Sleepathon and the Boot Camp Challenge certainly helped as well. But like Owen and the rest of the Screaming Gophers, she passes on multiple opportunities to vote out Heather. And I consider her inability to get a Heather a bigger knock on her game than Owen's, as Heather was more actively opposed to Gwen than she was to Owen. At the merge, the women are divided with Gwen and Lashana on one side and Heather and Lindsay on the another side, with Bridget kinda in the middle. However, she does side with Gwen, so that's something. But then we get to the final 11, where Heather creates a rift between her and Trent. It's not great that she and Trent allowed Heather, someone that's been widely disliked all season, to get in their heads like that. But it also convinces most of the players to vote out Heather should she lose immunity. But then Heather wins immunity, and Lashana convinces everyone to vote out Trent, despite Gwen not even wanting that. Obviously, this is a very bad look on Gwen's game, as she was very close to Trent and could have patched things up had they gotten more time. But it's also bad that she allowed Lashana to put this blindside together. Had those two talked, Gwen could have convinced her to target Lindsay as a way of weakening Heather. But the next round, Gwen is on board again to get rid of Heather, but she can't, as she once again wins immunity. And to add insult to injury, the guys form an alliance and take advantage of the division within the women to take out Bridget. Again, you can give Gwen credit for not being targeted herself, but losing Bridget isn't ideal either. Next two rounds are kind of whatever, but then she gets in the bottom two twice in a row at the final 7 with Izzy and again at the final 6 with Jeff. That's not particularly great. Through that, she gets to the final 5 in a position where she's in a duo with Lashana and Heather. While that isn't an ideal position, she could have gotten Heather out as long as she didn't win immunity. But instead of it being a normal round, they have the next vote out be decided by the eliminated players. Because why not? And while they intend to vote out Heather, they accidentally vote out Lashana, which is very bad for Gwen's game. And then at the final 4, she wins joint immunity with Heather. At the final 3, she and Owen gang up on Heather to ensure that they're the final 2. And coming into the finale, Gwen had the support of half the eliminated players, but 6 of the 10 players that made the merge. And again, I talked about this with Owen, how she was in the better position coming into the final two if it were to have been a jury vote. But then she loses most of that support when Owen promises to throw a party. I think that shows at least some merit for the relationship she built while on the island, even if she couldn't retain them had it been a regular jury vote. So, when looking at her game, I think Gwen was a bit more involved in the drama as she and Heather crossed paths multiple times, and I guess you could say she was a bit more involved in the decision making than Owen was. And that's why I have her above Owen on my winner ranking. I feel like there are more blatant relationships that she tried to use for game purposes, such as her relationship with Trent and also with Lashana. Even so, I feel like Gwen had more low points in her game than Owen. The Trent round was very bad, as I mentioned earlier, both in the sense that she allowed Heather to get in her head and her failure to convince Lashana to not target Trent after Heather won immunity. Her being in the bottom two twice in a row also isn't a good look for her. And really, her inability to get rid of Heather is something I hold more against Gwen than I do against Owen, as Heather probably would have targeted Gwen before she ever targeted Owen. It would have been one thing if Gwen was deliberately keeping Heather around as a source of drama and to keep a target off her back, but Gwen wasn't looking at the game that way. And like I said, Heather is involving her in that drama, which only weighs her down. So, when assessing Gwen's game, I feel like she did more to make her fate than Owen, which is a big reason I have her above Owen on this winner ranking. But Owen's likability handed a better positioning throughout the game, and I feel like Gwen on a whole didn't show as much dominance throughout her game as some of the other winners we'll be talking about. So because of that, I have her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I had no idea what to do with this winner, as I feel like there are some good parts of their game, and I also feel like there are some bad elements of their game, and I kind of went back and forth, sort of comparing them to that of other winners, and I kind of landed them here at number 6. So at number 6, we have the winner of Total Drama Revenge of the Island. We have Lightning. Now, I feel like Lightning played a good game but not without its flaws. Now, Cameron attended a lot more elimination ceremonies in the pre merge than his fellow finalist, Cameron. While you think that means there's more to discuss with Lightning's game, really we don't see much from him strategically. Despite getting on a lot of his teammates' nerves, Lightning is able to cruise through a lot of the early votes, largely due to there being easy votes in Stacy, Dakota, and B. And of course, there's also the physical element of him being useful in challenges. Even so, I would say that Scott is more involved in the decision making for the Toxic Rats than Lightning was, whose screen time again is more dedicated to physical strength and stuff happening at the challenges. Granted, Lightning is in the majority, and you have to give him credit for surviving round after round without getting targeted. But like Cameron, there just isn't a lot to say. He is in the bottom two during the Brook round, but considering there were only 3 people on the tribe by that point, and he was getting along with Joe to where he was safe anyway, I won't hold that too much against him. At the merge, he's in alliance with Joe, which you can kind of credit him, but it's also implied that Joe isn't planning on taking him to the end. He also has a somewhat decent relationship with Scott, at least based on what we saw earlier in the season. Lightning is benefited after Scott wins the Final Six immunity challenge and eliminates Mike, which in theory should set up Lightning pretty well to make the final 3. But it's also during this time that his relationship with Joe starts to deteriorate. The two of them lose trust overnight, and it seems like Lightning will be in danger, especially once he fails to win immunity and is in the bottom 2. But he's able to outplay Joe by building a closer bond with Cameron, resulting in the two of them blindsiding Joe in a 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 vote. So that's something I had to give him some credit for. But then there's the final 4, where he essentially gets screwed over by Cameron winning immunity, leaving Scott to be voted out 2 to 1 to 1. Now, we don't know exactly where the votes came from in this situation. My best guess is that Cameron voted for Lightning, as Lightning was mad at him for winning said immunity challenge, and Cameron is scared of him getting revenge. Scott and Zoe voted against each other as they hated each other, leaving Lightning as the deciding vote. Assuming that's the case, then I think it's a misstep for Lightning as he goes into the final 3 with Cameron and Zoe, a duo that's never flipping on each other. meaning he has to win the immunity challenge to survive. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think Cameron winning Final Four immunity already screwed over Lightning, as it ensures that he has to win Final Three immunity no matter what. As I feel like even in a Cameron Lightning Scott Final Three, Cameron would take Scott due to Lightning's hunger for revenge, and Scott would also take Cameron as an easier opponent in the final challenge. So either way, it's not an ideal situation. But I still think he should have kept Scott, as there was at least a sliver of a chance he could be talked into taking Lightning. Whereas Zoe, I feel like there's a 0% chance of that happening. But he wins Final Three immunity, but like I said, he needed that in order to survive. He takes Cameron to the end thinking he's easier to beat, which I had to give him some credit for, and he beats Cameron at the end. So I feel like Lightning is a weird game to assess. I think he played pretty well in the pre-merge. He wasn't in the driver's seat. I feel like that belonged to Scott, but he was in the majority for the most part, was an asset to his team in challenges, and had some positive relationships despite his less than perfect social play. His post merge was okay. He's able to get rid of Mike, which I think is a credit to him, and he should have been in a position to pick off Cameron and Zoe thereafter, getting into a better Final Three against Joe and Scott. While it would have been harder for him to win Final Three immunity in that scenario, I think he also would have been had a better chance of being taken to the end. But instead, he lets go of his relationship with Joe. And I'll blame Joe to an extent as well for letting go of Lightning, but he allows that relationship to go, votes her out, and then is unable to vote out Cameron or Zoe at the Final Four. And I would say that's the biggest knock against his game, that he didn't go to the end against the right people. Now, credit to him, he's able to win those final two immunity challenges against people that aren't as strong physically as Joe or Scott. But if Cameron or Zoe had won final three immunity, he's a goner at that point. But the reason I have him this high on the list is because I feel like he was at least more active in the game than Owen. Like I said, he was in the majority for a decent chunk of the pre-merge, and we actually got to saw some of his alliances and some of his relationships and how that translated to the game. That's something I at least had to give him some credit for over Owen. And while he did have some low points, I don't feel like they were as egregious as some of the ones we talked about already. So I have Lightning here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I know some people will be a bit surprised at how high this person is on the list. I mean, I feel like if we're just going based off character or how fitting they are as a winner, I'm sure this person would be lower as they are a pretty underwhelming character. But I feel like just looking at their game, there is a lot good in it. So at number 5, we have the winner of Total Drama All Stars. We have Zoe. Now, I actually think Zoe played a pretty good game. I mean, I think it's less impressive than Mike's. I mean, we'll talk about Mike a bit later, but I feel like there are just fewer issues or fewer downsides to her game. She starts off the game with a built in alliance on the heroic hamsters with Mike and Cameron. She trusts Mike deeply, but slowly picks up on his unusual behavior, unaware that's due to Mal. When Duncan joins her team, she's the only one he really connects with, which you could give her some credit for. But again, not much is made of her pre-merge as each of those votes are quite apparent. But despite Duncan warning her about Mal, she doesn't believe it and commits to reaching to the end with Mike and Cameron. And while Mal fueling paranoia into Cameron, and perhaps the quote unquote unanimous vote should have been a red flag for her, she remains loyal to the guy. In fact, she blames Alejandro for the quote unquote unanimous vote, feeding into Mal's power play, and votes him out after winning immunity. This, along with losing Cameron due to medevac, I guess, puts Zoe in a pretty bad position in the final 5. There, Courtney intended to vote out Zoe, with Gwen and Scott on her side. She seemingly had no clue this was coming, and it took Mike pulling up a piece of paper with the plan laid out that makes her and everyone else realize this. Now, Zoe wins immunity anyway, but the fact that she came into that round on the bottom, and the fact that it took other people's actions to get her out of that position is a knock. And then we get to the final 4, where she wins immunity for the third straight time, votes out Scott, and is guaranteed final 2 after Gwen is ejected. While the Gwen ejection was beneficial to both Mike and Zoe, the thing I'll credit Zoe over Mike is that she was better positioned in that final 3. While she would have taken Mike to the end had she won final 3 immunity, both Gwen and Mike would have taken her as well. So that is a plus at least. And she wins at the end against Mike. So looking at her game, it's certainly less contentious than Mike's in the sense that she didn't have a different personality controlling her for half of it. I also think Zoe was better positioned than Mike throughout the game. She never really made people suspicious of her in the same way Mike or Mal did. She even built more connections than Mike, as we see her be on good terms with Duncan, Alejandro, and Gwen. And unlike Mike, she didn't need the Gwen ejection to guarantee her spot at the end. Really, the only point in the game where Zoe was in a worse position than Mike was at the final five, where Courtney was playing to target her first. Now, the main negative for her game is simply the fact that she wasn't as aggressive strategically as Mike. And we'll talk about Mike a bit later, like I said. While she didn't exactly need to be, the fact that she didn't do much to help Cameron once Mal started tormenting him is a pretty big red flag. Her losing Cameron at the final seven is also pretty bad, and also the fact that she did very little to get herself off the bottom at the final five is another thing I'll knock against her game. And of course, there's the fact that despite questioning Mike multiple times, she kept going back to him. Now, one could argue that she needed Mike around to help her get to the end, and while that is partially true, I feel like that argument only cements the fact that Mike played more for the duo than Zoe did. But the other side is that there were people Zoe got along with and could have feasibly worked with if she wanted to turn on Mike. She had Cameron, and I'm sure she could have made inroads with Duncan, Alejandro, or Gwen. So I think her staying very loyal to Mike, despite him playing very aggressively and him possibly could have stolen the win from her in that final challenge in the final two is something I'll hold against her. But really, I don't have much negative to say compared to a lot of the other winners we talked about. I mean, I'm personally not much of a Zoe fan, but when looking at her game, I think she played relatively well in the season. I mean, outside that final five, she was never in direct danger of going home. And the fact that she was able to build at least some connections outside of Mike and Cameron is a big thing I'll give her credit for. But I feel like the other four players played a bit more impressively on their winning seasons. So because of that, I had to leave Zoe here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we're actually at the highest ranked winner from the first 3 seasons of the show, the 26 episode seasons. I'm sure some people are a bit surprised by how high I have this person, but I think looking at their game, they played pretty impressively. So at number 4, we have the winner of Total Drama Action. We have Beth. Now, I actually think Beth played a pretty good game. Now, again, it's not without its flaws, but I feel like the fact that she was never in danger the same way that some of the other winners we talked about are is very impressive on her end. Now, she came off Island where she had a less than stellar run there, but she came into the season with a clean slate. Right away, she charms people with her newly found confidence. She's also benefited from getting picked on the killer grips with her closest ally Lindsay and away from her enemy Heather. While our team lost 5 of the 7 immunity challenges pre-merge, she was never in much danger of going home. Even so, Beth isn't really in the driver's seat strategically. Justin is the one dominating the team, and Beth is completely awestruck by him. Early on, we see Justin build an alliance with her and Lindsay, intending to manipulate them much like Heather did in Island. Beth and Lindsay go along with Justin's plans for much of the pre-merge. Now, I know some people will knock this against her, and I knock it to some extent in that she was doing it more because she liked Justin than for any strategic reason. But she was in the majority through this, and through that, she votes out Trent and Izzy both times. But as time passes, the two of them, Beth and Lindsay, slowly start distancing themselves from Justin. They start looking past his looks and start to play the game for themselves. When Courtney enters the game, Beth, along with a lot of the other players, are pretty solidly against her. Coming to the merge, Beth and Lindsay are pretty much working side by side. They completely distance themselves from Justin, and that point on, they really play the game for themselves, which I have to give them a lot of credit for. They try to make a move against Duncan and Courtney. But despite Harold, the swing vote, having a crush on Lashana, Beth and her alliance are unable to get him to their side, and Lashana gets voted out there. That's not great. The next round, Courtney wins immunity, and you think Beth would try to make another shot at Duncan, but Justin goes out instead, which is fine for her game. After that, she and Lindsay are able to flip Harold, Despite Owen's unwillingness to cooperate, they finally get the numbers to vote out Duncan and pit Courtney into a corner. And the plan would have gone off, except for Lindsay accidentally voting herself out of the game. Obviously, losing Lindsay is a big blow to Beth's game, as she loses her closest ally, but I feel like I still have to give Beth a lot of credit here, as she at least got the numbers together to vote out Duncan and Courtney. And the fact that that plan didn't work out wasn't her fault, so I don't think I can blame Beth too much for that. But from that point on, Beth wins out, securing both the Final Five and Final Four immunities. Along the way, she does attempt to form an alliance with Courtney. However, that falls apart fairly quickly, given the distrust between the two. But it doesn't matter. She wins those challenges, despite not really needing them. Like, while I'm sure Courtney would have voted against her had she lost one of those immunities, I don't think she would have been voted out straight right. And through this, she gets to the end with Duncan. Now, to be fair, Duncan is one of her tougher beats, both as a physical competitor and as a jury threat. However, she is able to pull it out at the end. Returning to the jury scenario I mentioned earlier, Beth would have had the locked votes of DJ and Lindsay, both of which were confirmed on the show, as well as Lashana and Harold, both of whom had a better relationship with Beth than with Duncan. Now, in the scenario where she wins, she would most likely also get the votes of Trent, who harbored some resentment against Duncan for ruining his relationship with Gwen, and Justin, who, while respecting Duncan as a decent amount, is probably more open to persuasion than most of the other jury votes. Again, I essentially see Justin as a swing vote no matter what the scenario is. So speaking more broadly about her game, I think Beth was a bit less dominant than Duncan in the pre-merge, as she spent a lot of the stretch just following Justin. Now again, she was in the majority at least, but she wasn't really being dominant. It's really only around the merge where she and Lindsay start playing for themselves, and I would give Beth a decent amount of credit for that shift, even if they're not super effective at getting people out. She tries to vote out Duncan at the final seven, but doesn't get it. She's able to get Justin out, like in the next round. And while she loses Lindsay afterwards, I at least had to give her credit for having the numbers there to vote out Duncan. Another boon for her is that she was never in danger the same way Duncan was. She was never in the bottom two during the season, and even got the first kill to Chris twice during the second Izzy round and during the first Owen round. So I think it was a debate for me between Zoe and Beth. I feel like both of them played pretty similar games to where I wouldn't say they got their way all the time, but generally speaking, they were pretty effective. It's just a matter of where to rank them. And the reason I decided to put Beth slightly higher is that she was at least never endangered. Like, she was always pretty well positioned. She never had that final five situation to where she would have been in danger had the plan not been blown up. So I might go back and forth between Zoe and Beth, but at least for this list, I decided to put Beth at number four. Now we're at the top three, and like I alluded to a moment ago, these top three are all from the later seasons of the show, those being the three 13 episode seasons. And it's just a matter of the order. And at number three, I know some people will be surprised at how high this person is as well. But again, just going off their game, I think there's a lot of good things there. So, number three, we have the winner of Total Drama Pockettail Island. We have Shawn. Now, I actually think Shawn also played a pretty good game. Right off the bat, Shawn does struggle a bit socially, dissing himself from his teammates due to him thinking they might be zombies. Despite this, he's able to build some decent connections early on, particularly with Dave and Jasmine from the other team. And he has a good enough relationship with Skye, and while his team loses the first few challenges, they waste little time in taking out easy targets in Beardo and Leonard. But after that, he never attends another elimination ceremony the rest of the pre-merge. In episode 7, Sugar offers him an alliance as a way of targeting Dave and Skye, which he declines. I mean, yeah, he declines it as it's probably not in his best interest, but I at least give him credit to where Sugar was at least willing to work with him. Then at the merge, he loses Dave, although that's largely due to Dave being Dave. Afterwards, his relationship with Jasmine becomes romantic, and the double ejection propels him, Skye, and Jasmine to the final four, where he's in a great position. All three people left in the game want to take him to the end. Granted, that doesn't matter as much as the final four is determined by a challenge where he manages to come in first, so even then, it's not that big of an issue for him. And he also wins the final three immunity, ensuring a spot at the end. Now, I'm sure some people may say that Shawn was harmed by this format, as he might have had a better shot against Sugar. However, I don't really believe this, as given Sugar's propensity to cheat, I could see why he wouldn't want to go against that in the final two. But through this format, he gets to the end with Skye and wins. So on the whole, I think Shawn played a pretty good game. Again, he was never really in the driver's seat strategically, but he was well liked. He had a number of solid alliances throughout the game. We see people want to work with him, and even people like Sugar were willing to work with him. He was, for better or worse, one of the better positioned people on this season. Now, was he perfect? No. He did have a number of social missteps. Like I said early on, he struggled to connect with people. There's also the fact, I didn't even mention this, like his relationship with Jasmine did go south for a few episodes as she had a hard time trusting him. But he's able to repair that, like by the time of the merge to where they are actually working, like to where she could have been a number for him realistically. Beyond that, there was this whole zombie session, which again made it hard for him to connect with people, but also made him blind to certain things. But again, I feel like Beth, he was never in danger the whole season. He won some immunities that I don't think he really needed. And again, I feel like he was very well positioned through a lot of the game. Like I have to give him a lot of credit for being as well positioned as he was and playing somewhat actively. But with that said, I don't think he played as actively as the top two winners on this list, so I have to leave him here at number three. Now we're moving on to number two, and again, I feel like this person played a pretty impressive game. I feel like this top two is the definitive top two. It's just a matter of the order. So at number two, I decided to go with the person that was probably a little less dominant, but I think more people can at least agree that he played a strong game. And number two, we have the winner of Total Drama Revenge of the Island. We have Cameron. Now, like I said, I think Cameron played a pretty good game on the whole. Now, like Shawn, he wasn't the best socially, and initially he struggled to make bonds. Even so, he was benefited from being on the Mutant Maggots, which is the more successful team in challenges during the pre-merge. In fact, Cameron only attends one elimination ceremony the entire pre-merge, which is a bit insane. I mean, granted, he is responsible for some of those challenge wins, but still. Despite his early struggles, he's able to find a group with Mike and Zoe. When he finally attends an elimination ceremony, he and Mike attempt to vote out Scott, only for Scott to play the invincibility statue, which is basically an idol, and sends out Dakota instead. Again, this wasn't the ideal move as he technically wasn't in the numbers, but losing Dakota wasn't that big of a loss for him. At the merge, Scott finds out about Mike's multiple personality disorder, and Cameron tries desperately to keep Scott from telling Zoe, thinking it would shatter his alliance. And really, none of this looks good for Cameron, as he just spills information to Scott. He also tries to build an alliance with Joe, which goes nowhere. But then Scott wins immunity and casts a sole vote to evict Mike. And while he can credit Cameron that Scott didn't target him instead, this isn't a great look for Cameron as he loses an ally. And on paper, he and Zoe should be in the minority in the next two boots. But instead, Cameron wins the next two immunities and benefits from some outside developments. The main one being that Lightning and Joe, two people that previously had an alliance, turned on each other, which effectively made Cameron the swing vote at the next elimination ceremony. He ends up voting out Joe, which is good, as while Joe did approach him for an alliance, it was pretty clear that only stemmed from her relationship with Lightning being on the rocks. After that, he wins immunity again, albeit accidentally, which enables him and Zoe to get rid of Scott and guarantees him a spot in the final two. Zoe would have taken him to the end as her ally, and Lightning, despite feeling like Cameron stole Final Four immunity from him, would have also taken him due to him being perceived as less of a threat. Now, Lightning is his tougher beat in the final challenge, but the fact that he's at least guaranteed a spot at the end is very impressive. But he gets to the final two and beats Lightning, which you can give him some credit for. Now, admittedly, Cameron's game is a bit tougher to assess as, again, there just isn't a lot to talk about pre-merge. He only attended 5 elimination ceremonies the entire season, and when you factor in his individual immunity wins, he was only eligible to be voted out 3 times. That is pretty ridiculous, and I have to give him some credit for avoiding the block as much as he did. Now, again, he did benefit from being on the better tribe. As I think had they lost the first challenge, he might have been in some trouble there. But he was able to buy enough time to form a tight three that stuck together. Now, admittedly, he was the third in that group, but it's still something at least. While he technically didn't vote correctly in the Dakota round, he wasn't on the outs per se. I would say the Mike round is the only time the entire game where he wasn't really in control. And after that point, he was able to lower his threat level despite winning 2 immunities in a row, which I find impressive. And also, there's the fact that he was the swing vote during the Joe eviction, despite him initially coming into that round seemingly on the outs. Now, again, he didn't do much to break up Lightning and Joe's alliance, but still, the fact that he was able to get into that position was something I can give him credit for. Not to mention the fact that he was effectively able to better his position by voting out Joe and Scott in the process, as I feel like he is someone that was guaranteed to get to the end in really the only season that where the final three was an actual round decided by a vote. So I feel like that's something you can give him a lot of credit for. But again, I feel like his game, while good in a lot of respects, just isn't as impressive as the number one spot. So I have to leave him here at number two. Now we're moving on to number one. The best winner in Total Drama, in my opinion, is the winner of Total Drama All Stars. We have Mike. Now I know there's going to be a lot of controversy over this, mainly because of the Mal situation. I know, it makes him a very weird winner to talk about, considering he spent a decent chunk of the season not even in control of his own body. I feel like the Mal situation calls into question like his agency throughout the game, like whether to give Mike credit for things that Mal did. Like, for me, on one hand, Mal is one of Mike's personalities, meaning there is a portion of Mike's brain that is capable of pulling off the things that Mal is able to do. On the other hand, Mike doesn't have a lot of control over when his different personalities spawn, Mal even more so. So, it's harder to say with certainty that he deserves credit for making moves when it seems like it was done unintentionally, but I'll do my best. Anyway, he, Zoe, and Cameron all end up on the heroic hamsters together, giving him a pretty built-in alliance right off the bat. Aside from Mal materializing in episode 2, much of the early game is ho-hum. They vote out Lindsay, they vote out Sam, not too much to say. But as Mal starts to act out more, Duncan becomes more suspicious while Zoe starts to get scared of him. Episode 6 is when Mal takes full control of his body, which obviously makes his game harder to assess. He starts playing more aggressively at the final 8, first by forming an alliance with Alejandro, giving some additional security on top of his group with Cameron and Zoe, but then he tries getting rid of Cameron by rigging the votes. Like, I get that Mal is evil and he does bad stuff just for the sake of it, but he has zero reason to be getting rid of Cameron at this point. Despite this misstep, things work out for him after Duncan, one of the few people suspicious of him, gets ejected, nullifying the Cameron vote. Regardless of this Mal debate, you can't deny that this was a lucky break for Mike. But then the very next episode, he continues feeding paranoia into Cameron for no real reason, and then Cameron is medevaced. So, congratulations. On the bright side, he does use Cameron to throw a wrench into Courtney and Scott's relationship, which could have been an obstacle to him in the end game, but you also have to knock him for not leveraging that to vote out one of those two outright. After that, he targets Alejandro, who was catching on to him by that point, and while he is in the bottom two at that elimination ceremony, he clearly has the numbers to survive. But then coming into the final 5, he's in a pretty tough spot. Courtney was still close to Gwen by that point, and while she was previously mad at him, was willing to bring Scott to the end. There was a real likelihood that Zoe would have been out at 5 and Mike at 4. But unfortunately for Courtney, she was dumb enough to write down this plan on paper. But because of this, Mike is able to find the paper and use it to blow up Courtney's spot, turn Scott against her, and vote her out on the final 5. Now, while I blame Courtney a lot for her mistake of writing her plan down, I do have to credit Mike for using that to better his position. At the final 4, Zoe wins immunity, casts a sole vote to evict Scott, and automatically gets to the final 2 when Gwen gets ejected. I feel like the Gwen injection is something that greatly benefited Mike, as Gwen was someone that would have voted him out had she won final 3 immunity. After that, he defeats Mal and wins the game. So, if we completely ignore the Mal situation and examine the game at face value, I think Mike played a extremely impressive game. He was almost always in the majority, was pretty well positioned for most of the game, and played a key role in voting out Alejandro and Courtney. Even so, there are missteps. One of them is targeting Cameron right after the merge. Cameron was completely loyal to Mike, and even factoring in the Mal situation, could have been a number for him to take out people not loyal to him, people like Duncan, Courtney, and Gwen. And in fact, him driving Cameron off a cliff is the main reason Alejandro started becoming suspicious of Mike in the first place, which essentially forced him to target Alejandro the very next round. So, to that end, I think Mike was susceptible to being evil just for the sake of being evil, and that's not even including all the little stuff he did, like breaking people's possessions. He's also benefited by things outside of his control, like starting off the game with a built in alliance, Duncan getting ejected, Courtney leaving behind concrete evidence of her endgame plan, and Gwen getting ejected the same night that Scott was voted out. While these strokes of luck aren't as massive or game breaking as some of the other winners we've discussed, they're issues nonetheless. And then there's the biggest factor, which is the Mal situation. It's really hard to reconcile the fact that we essentially saw two different people playing in one body, and truthfully, both of them benefited from the other's presence. Mike would have gone to the end of the season, wouldn't have gone to the end of the season if weren't for Mal's cutthroat gameplay manipulation, no question. But Mal wouldn't have gone to the end either. He wouldn't have been able to execute a lot of his plans if they didn't have the connections and cover that Mike provided. And despite real life pointing to the contrary, the show goes out of its way to present Mike and Mal as two completely different people. So, to that end, how much credit can I really give Mike for the game that he played? I thought about it for a bit, and ultimately I decided to not punish Mike that much for this factor. Because one, there are bigger things you can knock a player for, as we've already discussed with previous entries. And second, I feel like the Mal situation affects Mike more as a player in general. On a list where we're just assessing the game being played, I don't think that affects too much. And I think just looking at the game being played, the specific strategic decisions, the positioning, the alliances. I feel like all that points to Mal being or Mike being a very dominant winner. So I think because of that, I have to put Mike at number one, as I feel like none of the other players that have won the game have demonstrated the same level of dominance. Well, except for Alejandro, but at least with Mike, he was never voted out like Alejandro. Now, to be fair, I think if we ignore the Alejandro getting voted out Final Four thing, I think Alejandro is probably above Mike on this list, as I feel like Alejandro was more blatantly dominant and more manipulative throughout and didn't do as much stuff that was evil just for the sake of being evil. But because Alejandro was voted out, had that major flaw against him, I decided to kick Alejandro down. And Mike, who played pretty similarly in a lot of regards, is someone that played good enough on this one specific season to be number one on my winner ranking. So I have Mike at number one. There we go. That is my winner ranking for Total Drama. Now I have more videos planned like this moving forward. I have more MLP videos. I have more Total Drama videos. And of course, I also have more Survivor videos. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like if you like it, you can check out other ones. But for now, that is the video. See ya.